They promised Britain would recover. After decades of decline, there'd be growth again, investment again, a future again. But by late 2025, the economy contracted.
Britain's economy is under incredible strain, more than you may realise.
Consumers vanished from shops. The splutter had begun. This isn't another recession. The data suggests Britain has entered the final phase of economic collapse. Here's what that actually means. And the numbers tell a brutal story. While politicians debate policy tweaks, Britain is being quietly overtaken by countries it once dominated. Poland and Lithuania are closing the income gap. Eastern European nations that were rebuilding from rubble 40 years ago now compete with British living standards. This isn't supposed to happen to a G7 economy. This isn't supposed to happen to the nation that gave the world the Industrial Revolution. Yet here we are in January 2026, watching the UK economy slip into what economists refuse to call what it is: a managed decline so systematic, so persistent, that recovery isn't just unlikely anymore. It may be impossible under the current system. The signs were always there: productivity stagnating for over a decade, industrial plants closing across steel, chemicals, plastics, and oil sectors, capital fleeing to friendlier shores. But the establishment kept promising the same thing. One more policy, one more stimulus, one more election cycle, and Britain would turn the corner. The corner never came. Instead, something else arrived. A feedback loop where every supposed solution makes the underlying problems worse. Where higher taxes drive away the very wealth creators needed to fund public services. Where expensive climate policies crush the industrial base they're meant to modernize. Let that sink in. Britain isn't just declining anymore. It's trapped in a system that transforms every attempt at recovery into deeper decay. The question isn't whether this is sustainable. The question is how much worse it gets before the political class admits what the data already shows. The feedback loop runs deeper than most people realize. It starts with a simple economic reality that politicians won't acknowledge. When productivity stops growing, everything else breaks down. Britain's productivity has been stuck in neutral for 15 years. Each worker produces roughly the same value today as they did in 2010. Meanwhile, the government kept making promises based on growth that never came. Free healthcare for an aging population, net zero carbon emissions by 2030, universal basic services, massive infrastructure projects. All of this costs money. Money the economy isn't generating fast enough to cover the bills. So where does the government find the cash? They raise taxes, they borrow more, they print money and hope inflation stays manageable. But here's what happens next. The most productive people and businesses look at their tax bills and make a simple calculation: stay in Britain and hand over 50, 60, even 70% of what they earn, or move somewhere that wants their investment. They move. High earners, entrepreneurs, and productive businesses pack up and leave. The tax base shrinks just when the government needs it most. Fewer people paying in, more people depending on services that are already underfunded. The Mises Institute calls this not an unmanaged collapse, but a decline administered through technocratic consensus. It's not chaos. It's a system working exactly as designed, a system that prioritizes political promises over economic reality. Look at the industrial data. Steel production down, chemical plants closing, oil refineries shutting down. These aren't temporary setbacks. They're permanent exits from sectors Britain once dominated. The Economy Help Channel tracked the numbers. Industrial production has fallen consistently since its pre-COVID recovery. Each closure represents jobs gone forever, tax revenue lost permanently. Meanwhile, the costs keep piling up. Net zero policies alone carry an estimated price tag of £70,000 to £100,000 per household, not in annual costs. Total burden. The kind of number that makes families choose between heating and eating, while the government lectures them about saving the planet. This is economic and social freefall disguised as responsible governance. The very policies meant to modernize Britain are destroying its productive capacity. The regulations meant to protect workers are driving employers overseas. The taxes meant to fund public services are shrinking the economy that pays for them. And the most damaging part? It's accelerating. Each business that leaves makes the next departure easier. Each tax increase pushes more wealth creators toward the exit. Each factory closure reduces the industrial base that could have supported future growth. By early 2026, the pattern is unmistakable. Britain has entered a death spiral where every solution creates two new problems, where every attempt to stop the decline makes it worse. But here's what makes this truly devastating. The policy architects know exactly what they're doing. This isn't incompetence, it's ideology implemented regardless of consequences. A complete 180 from the market-oriented reforms that once made Britain wealthy. The Thatcher era proved Britain could reverse decline through bold economic reform. Deregulation, privatization, and lower taxes unleashed decades of growth. That model worked. It lifted living standards, created jobs, and made Britain competitive again. Today's political class has systematically dismantled every piece of that framework. They've replaced market mechanisms with central planning. They've substituted economic growth for social engineering. They've chosen ideological purity over national prosperity. The result is a country that's actively choosing poverty over wealth creation. A nation that punishes success while subsidizing failure. An economy designed to shrink rather than grow. This isn't about Brexit. It isn't about COVID. It isn't about global supply chains or energy shocks. Those are temporary disruptions. This is about fundamental policy choices that make recovery structurally impossible. Net zero mandates that force British industry to compete with one hand tied behind its back. Tax rates that make investment economically irrational. Regulations so complex that starting a business requires an army of lawyers. The Socialist Party sees the same decline from their perspective. They describe early 2026 as decline, decay, and anger under a system they call capitalism in crisis. They're wrong about the solution, but right about the symptoms. Public services crumbling, infrastructure failing, social cohesion breaking down. What's remarkable is the cross-ideological agreement. Free market economists and socialist activists both recognize that Britain is trapped in systemic failure. They disagree on causes and cures, but they agree on the basic reality. The current path leads nowhere good, yet somehow the mainstream economic forecasters paint a completely different picture. PwC projects 1.2% growth in 2026. RSM expects 0.8%. Both describe this as manageable, even optimistic given global conditions. Here's the disconnect that should terrify every British citizen. The same economy that critics describe as in freefall and collapse is being sold to the public as steady, if unspectacular, progress. 1.2% growth. Third fastest in the G7, they claim. Let that sink in. The same Britain losing industrial capacity every month is somehow outperforming Germany and France. The same economy where families can't afford groceries is supposedly winning the global growth race. This is where the final phase reveals itself most clearly, not in the collapse itself, but in the complete detachment from reality that enables it to continue. PwC's economists look at their spreadsheets and see adaptation after turmoil. They forecast inflation falling to 1.9% by the end of 2026, interest rates gently declining to 3.5%, house prices rising modestly, everything returning to manageable parameters. RSM takes a slightly more cautious view. They call 2026 a tougher year with growth around 0.8%. They worry about what they delicately term stagflation-light affordability crisis. But their overall message remains the same. Britain will muddle through. Muddle through to what? They never say. Muddle through the industrial closures? Muddle through the capital flight? Muddle through the demographic crisis and the net zero costs and the shrinking tax base? Their forecasts read like reports from a parallel universe. A Britain where productivity problems solve themselves, where net zero somehow pays for itself, where the most productive citizens decide to stay and pay higher taxes out of patriotic duty. This isn't economic analysis, it's institutional gaslighting on a national scale. The Economics Help Channel captured the absurdity perfectly. They reviewed the official data and the consensus forecasts, then asked the obvious question: which Britain are these economists looking at? Because it's not the one where GDP contracts month after month. It's not the one where consumers stay home because they can't afford to shop. The gap between official optimism and lived reality has become a chasm. Families struggling to heat their homes are told the economy is recovering. Workers watching their industries disappear are promised green jobs that never materialize. Small business owners crushed by regulations are lectured about resilience and adaptation. This disconnect isn't accidental, it's essential to maintaining the policy consensus that created the crisis. Because if mainstream institutions acknowledged the true scale of Britain's economic freefall, they'd have to admit their entire framework is wrong. They'd have to admit that net zero, as currently designed, is economically destructive. They'd have to admit that high taxes drive away investment. They'd have to admit that endless regulations strangle innovation. Most importantly, they'd have to admit that the current path leads to national impoverishment. Ministers make speeches about Britain's bright future, while factories close in their constituencies. Civil servants draft optimistic projections, while tax revenues fall short of targets month after month. This is what the final phase actually looks like. Not dramatic collapse, but systemic denial so complete that course correction becomes impossible. The final phase isn't collapse. It's the systematic inability to respond to collapse. The institutional capture so complete that reality itself becomes inadmissible evidence. This is where Britain stands in January 2026. Not at the beginning of decline, but trapped in its acceleration. The productivity crisis locked in by policy choices, the capital flight accelerated by tax policy, the industrial destruction celebrated as environmental progress. The mechanisms are now self-reinforcing. Each factory closure reduces the tax base, forcing higher rates on remaining businesses. Each entrepreneur who leaves makes the next departure more likely. Each regulation adds costs that push more companies toward foreign shores. Eastern European nations don't just compete with Britain anymore, they're beginning to overtake it. Countries that were rebuilding from socialism 30 years ago now offer better prospects for investment, innovation, and individual advancement. This is the ultimate humiliation. Poland's GDP per capita approaches British levels while moving in opposite directions. Lithuania attracts investment that once flowed to London. The reversal is nearly complete. The Thatcher era gains that lifted Britain from the sick man of Europe to a dynamic modern economy have been systematically erased. Not by external shocks or global forces, but by deliberate policy choices that prioritize ideology over prosperity. What makes this truly the final phase is the political impossibility of reversal. Both major parties embrace the same basic framework: high taxes, heavy regulation, net zero at any cost, and ever-expanding state control over economic activity. The consensus extends beyond party politics into the entire institutional structure. Civil service, academia, media, and major corporations all support the policies that are destroying British competitiveness. Challenge the framework, and you're excluded from respectable opinion. This institutional capture means Britain cannot course correct through normal political processes. The system has become immune to feedback from economic reality. Failure generates more of the same policies, just implemented more aggressively. The long-term trajectory is now clear. Without structural reform that no mainstream party will contemplate, Britain becomes a permanently lower growth, higher tax, lower income economy. A service sector dependent on financial flows rather than productive capacity. A nation that imports what it once manufactured and borrows what it once earned. The social implications follow inevitably. Declining living standards generate political instability. Failed promises create anger at the system itself. The moderate centre that enabled managed decline faces challenges from both left and right that promise radical change. But here's what you need to understand about this final phase. You weren't imagining it. The decline is real, measurable, and accelerating. Your suspicion that official forecasts don't match your lived experience is completely justified. The system is failing exactly as badly as it feels. The data proves what you already knew. Britain has entered a death spiral disguised as responsible governance, a managed decline so systematic that even naming it honestly becomes politically impossible. This story isn't over. New economic data releases monthly. Industrial closures continue. Tax flight accelerates. The feedback loop tightens with each policy announcement. If you want to track Britain's final phase as it unfolds, to understand the next thresholds before they're crossed, to stay ahead of the official narrative that refuses to acknowledge reality, then you need to follow this channel. Subscribe now to join the few who see past the institutional gaslighting to the hard numbers that reveal Britain's true trajectory. Because the final phase is just beginning, and the next revelations will be even more shocking than what we've covered today.